So my name is Patrick Kochanasz. I want to say thank you for coming out and hearing a little bit about me and my work. I've never done an artist talk before, so forgive me as I kind of stumble my way through it. But anyway, I'll touch on like three main things, I think, a little bit about myself and my background as an artist, and then some of my major influences, and finally a little bit about the work itself, some of the unique features that you probably notice while you're looking at it. So me, I'm not from Colorado originally, I'm from Eastern Pennsylvania. So I studied at the Baldwin School of Art for 5 years. And in that time, I took a bunch of different courses, studied a bunch of different mediums like acrylics, metal, jewelry, clay, pottery, and soft pastels. And I wouldn't say soft pastels are like my favorite medium, but they're the medium that has always made the most sense to me. I'm very much an illustrator at heart. I like drawing, I like illustrating, and there's something very simple, very easy, and uncomplicated about soft pastels. So in that there's nothing between you, the pastel, and the paper. There's no brush, there's no water, there's no preparation and setup. It's really just very straightforward, and I've always gravitated towards that. So I moved out to Colorado about 10 years ago, and since then my work has taken much more of a Western kind of flavor. I started getting into backpacking and hiking and camping shortly after I moved out here, and really fell in love with the West. I mean, how can you not? It's once you take a few trips deep into the backcountry, it's really hard to not be impacted by it. And so a lot of my work since then has come to reflect the impressions that I get from hiking and backpacking and whatnot. So one of my major influences, the biggest influence by far, is Japanese ukiyo-e. And I don't want this to be a history lesson, but I'll tell you a little bit about ukiyo-e. That's a Japanese term that means pictures of the floating world, is kind of the loose translation. That was an art movement in the 17th century through like the mid 19th century in Japan. And really what it was an ideology as much as it was an art movement of kind of releasing the like cares of life and approaching life with a much more kind of ethereal, carefree attitude. So if you're not familiar with ukiyo-e, probably the most famous piece is the Great Wave. It's this like big kind of stylistic cresting wave over some boats with Mount Fuji in the background. That's by Hokusai. That's probably the most famous Japanese work. And there is something very floaty, very kind of unearthly about it. And that attitude has really stuck with me in my approach. The first ukiyo-e work that I ever really fell in love with was also by Hokusai, and it was called A Strong Gust of Wind. And it's part of his 36 Views of Mount Fuji from the same series as the Great Wave. And it depicts people in a strong gust of wind, so caught in this like really strong gust. The foreground of the piece has amazing motion to it. So there's someone kind of holding a stack of papers, the papers are flying away, one person's losing their hat and reaching for it. It just has such a flow, such animation to it that I had never really seen anything quite like that. And then what really struck me was the background of the piece is Mount Fuji, but Mount Fuji is depicted as like a single black line. That's all it is. There's no shading, there's no detail to it. It's really just a single stroke of a black line in the sky. And for whatever reason, that painting to me does everything it needs to draw you into it. I mean, it does everything so masterfully. And parts of it are very complex and very detailed, and then other parts of it are very simple. And so I've learned a lot from ukiyo-e and have always known that's kind of the style I want to mimic. So my work is not woodblock prints like ukiyo-e, but a lot of the overall look and feel is very stylistically similar to that. And oddly enough, ukiyo-e was a major influence in the French Impressionism movement. So if you like French Impressionism and you like Van Gogh, just know that he was incredibly inspired by ukiyo-e when the prints kind of made their way to France. So the subject matter, like I said, I moved out here about 10 years ago, did a lot of hiking, backpacking. These are very much informed by the West, by Colorado, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. I've spent time in all of those places. And they're not really, I get this question a lot, they're not really meant to represent a specific location or a specific set of like geographic coordinates. They're inspired by everything and nothing at the same time. So they're inspired by a lot of what I see when I'm out backpacking and hiking, but they're not really, like I couldn't point to something and say, oh, that is this specific peak in this specific range, this specific place. So yeah, almost everything and nothing at the same time. And which is also reminiscent of ukiyo-e. These were not plein air artists. So they were not artists going out into nature, painting what they see. They were studio artists that kind of imaginatively recreated scenes that could exist, but didn't exist. They didn't actually witness these scenes. So that's the approach that I'd like to take, is that these are things that you could see out in the Rockies, out in the wild, but they're things you probably won't see. They're not things that actually do exist. So I think that's probably all I'll say about my influences. And then I'll just point out a handful of things about the work themselves that you probably notice in looking at them. And the first thing is that they are soft pastel. I get a lot of people who see this and say, they're like, I've never seen soft pastel like that. That doesn't look like soft pastel. And probably the reason is because probably the vast majority of soft pastel artists use some sort of blending tool in order to get a smoothness of color transition. That's a very common technique with soft pastel, and that's never the technique that I've wanted to take with soft pastel. I like the more rugged feel to it, and I like some of the negativity that you get from not blending it. So I like being able to see the black paper behind the image itself. I think it preserves some of the raw nature of the strokes of the pastel. And then the second is that I do work on black paper. That's also pretty unusual, and I don't know what to say about that other than it just has always made sense to me. It's just, I've never wanted to paint on anything else. There's something about the way the pastel shows on top of a black paper that really pops it, because everything is sort of light in color compared to black. So the vibrancy of the piece, I feel, is just exaggerated on black paper. And it's also a technique that I use for outlining. So I outline almost everything within the frame, all the main features within the composition with like an art pen. And that's how I achieve some definition. And the black paper actually allows me to do that because the pen sort of bleeds into the paper very, very easily. So that's kind of how it gets this illustrative look. I'm not trying for realism. It's really meant to be a more illustrative piece than it is an actual, piece of realism. So, and then the final thing I'll say is the edges. A lot of people ask me, like, is that cut out? How is that on there? It is cut out. Every piece is hand cut by me, and then mounted on top of a piece of mat board. And that actually started as a mistake. I used to cut my pieces out to a very standard size, very rigid outlines, and one time I messed up and felt like, actually that doesn't look half bad. So over the last probably 7 years, it's a technique I've really run with, and it preserves some of the unique kind of edges of how the pastel is applied to the paper that I find kind of interesting. And then I think more importantly, it actually builds depth to the piece. So you'll notice a lot of times the foremost thing in the piece is the path. And that just builds the illusion of depth in the paintings. And when you have paintings that are outlined in black lines, that's a really important thing, is to make sure that you get depth, because it's very easy to end up with a flat kind of one-dimensional image. So the cutout has actually served to move the foreground a little bit more forward, and is just a unique way to do that I found over the years. So I don't know, I think that's probably all I'll say. Maybe I'll just point out these two pieces over here. In talking about, the cutout, these two pieces are really unique in that they're actually two panes of paper separated by 2 panes of glass. So they're cut out to a greater degree than like a normal piece that you see. You have one plane here, like the aspens, the kind of foreground hill and the path is one piece of paper, and then a piece of glass, and the mountains and the lake are behind that. So it builds an additional element of depth that I think is really interesting. Very time consuming, very tedious, but like really fun, and kind of a fun approach that I tried for this show. So with that, if there's any questions, I'd love to answer, and if not, that's okay. I'll be around.